you ever seen a contract, secret, or twist of karma completely change someone's life? Story 1. Back in college, my roommate was a straight-up jerk. The kind of guy who would borrow your stuff and never return it, flirt with your girlfriend just to see if he could, and always found a way to weasel out of paying his share of rent. The worst part? He bragged about getting away with it. One day, he accidentally took my laptop to class instead of his. But what he didn't know was that I had been applying for jobs and had my autofill set up. He ended up submitting a job application under my name for a prestigious internship that I had zero chances of getting. He got the acceptance email, freaked out, and tried to undo it, but it was too late. The company already scheduled an interview. I decided to go just for the hell of it. I was upfront about the mix-up, but they were impressed by my honesty and still let me interview. I got the job. That internship turned into a full-time position after graduation, and now I make six figures. Meanwhile, my old roommate? He got caught plagiarizing in his final semester and had his degree revoked. I saw him last year, working retail, looking miserable. Some call it karma. I call it poetic justice. Story 2. My uncle used to own a struggling restaurant. He was a good chef but a terrible businessman, and the debt was piling up. One night, an old man walked in, ordered a cheap meal, and struck up a conversation with him. Turns out, this man was a retired lawyer who used to handle contracts for major franchises. After listening to my uncle vent about his financial struggles, the old man made a bizarre offer. I'll draft a contract. If you follow it to the letter, your life will change. My uncle, having nothing to lose, agreed. The contract was simple. He had to tweak the menu, change suppliers, and most importantly, introduce a loyalty program that rewarded repeat customers. Within a year, the restaurant exploded in popularity. Turned out, the old man knew what he was doing. My uncle now owns multiple locations, and the old man? He never asked for a dime, just came in for a meal once a week and smiled whenever he saw the packed restaurant. Story 3. In high school, there was this rich, arrogant kid, Jason, who bullied everyone. He used to torment this one quiet, nerdy girl named Sarah. He'd steal her homework, spread rumors, and even once humiliated her in front of the whole class. No one really stood up for her because Jason's dad was a big-shot lawyer who always bailed him out. Fast forward 10 years, and Jason's family business collapses. He ends up applying for a job at a major tech. He nails the first few rounds but freezes in the final interview when he sees the hiring manager, Sarah. Turns out, she founded a startup that got acquired by the company, and now she was running the show. She didn't humiliate him, didn't get revenge. She just looked at his resume and said, "Thanks for your time. We'll be in touch." He never heard back. A week later, his desperation led him to a retail job. Guess who showed up on his first day? Sarah, walking in with her team for a corporate event. The look on his face? Priceless. Karma had done its job. Story 4. My dad worked for a guy who made his employees sign the most ridiculous contracts. Non-competes, insane overtime clauses, even fines if you quit without a 3-month notice. Most people just accepted it because jobs were scarce. One day, an employee named Mark found a hidden clause that basically said if an employee worked there for more than 5 years, they were entitled to a massive severance package, an old policy the company forgot to remove. No one had stayed that long because of how awful the place was. Mark quietly spread the word to the few senior employees who had stuck it out. They all waited until their 5-year mark, then quit on the same day. The boss tried to fight it, but legally he had no choice. He had to pay out over $1 million in severance. The company folded within months. The best part? Mark had already lined up a new job and even hired one of the old employees to work under him. That small clause buried in legal jargon? It changed his life. Story 5. A guy I used to work with, Tom, was an absolute jerk to his wife. He cheated, lied, and controlled her finances so she'd be dependent on him. Everyone told her to leave, but she always said, "I have to wait." Turns out, she had been secretly working with a divorce lawyer for a year. Tom had inherited a large sum of money from his parents, and she found a legal loophole. If she filed for divorce on a specific date, she was entitled to half. If she waited too long, he could claim it as separate property. On the exact day she needed, she served him the papers. He laughed at first, thinking she'd never actually leave. Then he saw the financial breakdown and realized she was walking away with millions. Last I heard, she moved across the country and opened a small business. Tom, on the other hand, had to move back in with his parents. Karma worked like a slow-brewing storm, but when it hit hard. Story 6. My cousin was always the golden child of the family, entitled, lazy, and living off our wealthy grandmother. She manipulated her way into my grandma's will, convincing her to leave the majority of her estate to her, leaving the rest of us scraps. I never said anything because I knew karma has its own way of balancing things out. A few months before my grandma passed, my cousin wanted to speed up her inheritance, so she made a drastic mistake. She forged my grandma's signature on some legal documents, thinking no one would notice. Turns out, my grandma had already quietly changed her will, leaving everything to a charity and leaving my cousin with just a single dollar. The only reason we found out about the forgery was because the lawyer saw the old signature and knew it didn't match the revised. The lawyer pressed charges, and my cousin ended up not just losing everything, but also getting a felony record. Now, she's unemployable, broke, and blames everyone but herself. Meanwhile, my grandma's wealth went to a good cause, just as she wanted. Story 7. Back in college, my friend Mike and I were in a business competition where the winner got funding for their startup. We worked on a tech idea together, but I soon realized he was cutting corners, plagiarizing code, inflating numbers, and outright lying to judges. When I confronted him, he laughed and said, "That's business." I quit the team and warned him that this kind of thing catches up with you. He won the competition, got investors, and his startup took off. For a while, I felt like I had made the wrong choice. But 2 years later, karma struck. An investor noticed discrepancies in his reports and started digging. Turned out, Mike had lied about nearly everything, and his company crumbled under fraud investigations. He went from CEO to being sued for millions. Meanwhile, I worked hard, built my own startup, and, ironically, ended up hiring one of his former employees. Sometimes patience is all it takes for karma to do its. Story 8. A friend of mine, Sarah, was in a toxic marriage with a guy named Eric, who was emotionally abusive and controlling. She had always dreamed of being an artist, but he made sure she never pursued it, saying it was a waste of time. He handled all their finances, refused to let her have a bank account, and constantly belittled her. What he didn't know was that Sarah had a secret. She had been quietly saving money by selling small paintings online under a pseudonym, stashing the earnings in a hidden account. One day, a big-name influencer bought her work, and it went viral. She made more in a month than Eric had made in a year. That's when she decided it was time. She hired a lawyer, filed for divorce, and walked away with half of his assets, since he was the one who insisted on keeping everything joint. He lost everything: his control, his lifestyle, and his pride. Meanwhile, she's now a full-time artist, thriving and free. Story 9. There was a guy at my old job, Dan, who loved throwing his co-workers under the bus. He took credit for other people's ideas, gossiped to the boss, and even got a well-liked manager fired by planting fake evidence. Everyone hated him, but the boss loved him because he always seemed on top of things. One day, our company announced layoffs, and Dan, thinking he was untouchable, spread a rumor that one of the senior employees, Rick, was secretly job hunting and should be the first to go. What Dan didn't know was that Rick was actually good friends with the CEO. When the CEO heard the rumor, he decided to investigate, but instead of finding dirt on Rick, he found out how much Dan had been lying. Dan was fired on the spot. The best part? He had just bought a new house, assuming his job was secure. With no severance and no references, he had to move in with his parents. Meanwhile, Rick got promoted, and the office felt lighter without Dan's presence. Karma never forgets. Story 10. A guy I used to work with, Jake, was a trust fund kid who got away with everything. He crashed expensive cars, skipped work, and always bragged that his dad's money would save him no matter what. His job at our company was a joke. He barely showed up, and when he did, he took credit for things he didn't do. One day, his father, sick of Jake's attitude, did something none of us expected. He cut him off completely. No money, no bailout, no safety net. Jake thought it was a bluff until he checked his accounts and found them empty. His father had legally transferred everything to charity, leaving him with nothing but an old car and a pile of debts. Jake had to get a real job for the first time in his life. I ran into him a year later working as a waiter, looking exhausted. He wasn't arrogant anymore, just a regular guy trying to get by. It was the first time I'd ever seen him humble. His dad had given him the best lesson money could never buy. Story 11. My old boss was the kind of guy who thought he was invincible. He ran a construction company and regularly cut corners, using cheap materials, underpaying workers, and even bribing inspectors to look the other way. He treated contracts like suggestions, refusing to honor warranties or pay subcontractors on time. Everyone knew he was shady, but no one could touch him because he had good lawyers. Then one day, he made a critical mistake. A wealthy client caught wind that the materials used in their multi-million-dollar home were substandard. They sued, and during the case, it was discovered that my boss had been forging safety inspection reports for years. This triggered a deeper investigation, revealing even more fraudulent contracts and unpaid workers. His entire empire crumbled overnight. The state revoked his contractor's license, his assets were frozen, and he owed so much in lawsuits that he had to declare bankruptcy. The worst part? One of the workers he underpaid ended up starting his own company and took most of the old clients. That guy now runs the biggest construction firm in town, while my old boss is living in a tiny apartment, working odd jobs just to survive. Story 12. My dad's former best friend, Tim, was the definition of a backstabber. They started a small tech business together, and after a few years it was finally gaining traction. But Tim got greedy. He secretly negotiated with investors to buy out my dad's shares for a fraction of what they were worth, then forced him out of the company by manipulating a loophole in their contract. My dad was devastated. He had poured years into the business, and now he had nothing. Tim, on the other hand, celebrated like he had won the lottery, flaunting his newfound wealth. But karma had other plans. Turns out, my dad had written some of the core software for their product and still held intellectual property rights. When Tim tried to sell the company for a massive payout, my dad's lawyer sent a cease and desist letter, blocking the deal. No buyer wanted a lawsuit, so the company value plummeted. Within 2 years, it was worthless. Meanwhile, my dad had already moved on and started a new, better business. Tim, once flying high, was left with nothing but regret. Story 13. A woman I worked with, Amanda, was stuck in a toxic workplace. Her boss was a nightmare, underpaying employees, making them work unpaid overtime, and always threatening to fire people if they complained. Amanda knew something was off, so she started secretly keeping records. Emails, payroll documents, even recordings of illegal instructions. One day, her boss pushed too far. He fired an employee for taking sick leave, which was blatantly illegal. Amanda saw her chance. She handed all her evidence over to a lawyer and reported the company to labor authorities. The fallout was brutal. The company was hit with fines so large that it shut down within months. The boss lost everything, and Amanda? She got a massive settlement and used it to start her own business. The best part? She hired some of her old co-workers at fair wages. Story 14. Back in high school, there was a guy named Kyle who was the worst kind of bull, the smart, manipulative kind. He never got caught because he always made sure his victims looked like the problem. He even got one kid expelled by planting fake evidence in his locker. Years later, Kyle became a cop. And you guessed it, he didn't change. He abused his power, covered up his mistakes, and falsified reports. For a while, he got away with it. But one day, he pulled over the wrong person, a man who happened to have a dash cam and a very good lawyer. The footage showed Kyle fabricating charges and threatening the driver. It went viral, leading to an investigation. Turns out there were dozens of complaints against him. The police department, eager to save face, threw him under the bus. He lost his badge, pension, and credibility. Last I heard, he was working security at a strip mall, and the kitty got expelled? He became a successful defense attorney. Story 15. My neighbor Tom was the worst landlord imaginable. He was a slumlord, constantly overcharging tenants while refusing to fix basic things like plumbing and heating. He'd evict people for minor complaints and ignored housing laws because he thought no one could stop him. Then came Emily, a law student who moved into one of his buildings. She quickly noticed how illegal his lease agreements were, how he was pocketing security deposits, and how he avoided inspections. But instead of confronting him, she played it smart. She spent a year quietly gathering evidence. When she finally had enough, she didn't just report him. She filed a massive lawsuit representing herself. She found other former tenants and turned it into a class action. The court ruled in their favor, and Tom was forced to pay hundreds of thousands in fines and reimbursements. His properties were seized and he went bankrupt. Meanwhile, Emily used the settlement money to start her own legal practice, specializing in tenant rights. Story 16. A guy I used to work with, Kevin, had always been reckless with money. He had a great job, but he spent like a millionaire. Luxury cars, designer clothes, and first-class vacations. The catch? He was funding it all with credit cards and loans, convinced he'd always be able to make the payments. One day, a friend warned him about his spending habits. Kevin laughed it off, saying, "Debt doesn't matter if you never stop making money, but karma doesn't play favorites." His company unexpectedly downsized, and he was laid off with no severance. He tried to keep up appearances, but it wasn't long before the collectors came knocking. Within months, he lost his house, his cars were repossessed, and even his fiancée left him when she found out he was drowning in debt. The worst part? He had to move back in with his parents in his late 30s, completely broke. The guy who used to flash stacks of cash was now flipping burgers just to afford gas. He went from bragging about luxury vacations to hoping he could cover rent. If only he had listened before it was too late. Story 17. There was a woman in my town, Mrs. Reynolds, who was known for being absolutely ruthless when it came to her business. She ran a chain of rental properties and was notorious for evicting tenants over minor issues, jacking up rent unfairly, and using shady loopholes to avoid maintenance costs. She had a reputation for suing anyone who dared challenge her, and for years, she got away with it. But karma has patience. One of her tenants, an elderly veteran, had been evicted in the middle of winter over a technicality. The story made the local news and people started digging. A journalist discovered that Mrs. Reynolds had been engaging in fraudulent practices, overcharging security deposits, violating housing laws, and even forging signatures on eviction notices. The media storm led to a government investigation. She was slapped with multiple lawsuits, lost her rental licenses, and was forced to sell off her properties at a huge loss. The best part? The old veteran she evicted? He won a settlement large enough to buy a house outright. Story 18. Back in college, I had a classmate named Jake who was the ultimate opportunist. He was always scheming, always looking for ways to get ahead without doing any actual work. He would take credit for group projects, charm professors into giving him extensions, and even sabotage classmates if it meant making himself look better. He somehow landed a dream job right after graduation by lying on his resume, claiming he had experience he didn't. He was making big money and bragging about how easy it was to fool people. Then one day, karma came knocking. His company got a massive contract, and they needed someone to lead the project. Based on his fake credentials, they put Jake in charge. He had no idea what he was doing, and it showed. The project was a disaster, the client pulled out, and the company lost millions. An internal investigation revealed that Jake had lied on his resume. Not only was he fired, but the industry is small. Word spread fast and no one would hire him. Last I heard, he was delivering food, wondering where it all went wrong. Story 19. There was a guy at my old job, Matt, who lived for office politics. He was the type to pretend to be your friend while secretly working against you. He'd spread rumors, take credit for other people's ideas, and make sure he looked good in front of upper management. He played the game well for a while. One day, he set his sights on a coworker, Lisa, who was up for a promotion. He started a whisper campaign, telling the boss she was unreliable and even sabotaged one of her projects to make her look bad. It worked. Lisa lost the promotion. But what Matt didn't know was that Lisa had been keeping records of everything. She waited until the perfect moment. During a big meeting with the executives, she exposed him, showing emails, messages, and proof of his lies. Management was furious. Matt was fired on the spot. And the kicker? The promotion he stole from Lisa? She got it in the end. Matt tried to find another job, but word had already spread in the industry. Now he's working at a small firm, making half of what he used to. Meanwhile, Lisa is thriving, and no one misses Matt's scheming ways. Story 20. My cousin Andy was always a gambler, not just in casinos, but in life. He would cut corners, make shady deals, and always thought he was the smartest person in the room. He once borrowed a huge amount of money from some questionable people, thinking he could flip it into a big investment. Well, the investment flopped. And those people? They weren't the forgiving type. Desperate, Andy pulled a last-ditch move. He faked a contract, trying to make it seem like he was owed money from an old business deal. He thought he was being clever, but he forgot one thing. The person he forged the contract against was a lawyer. That lawyer took him to court, and it turned out Andy had done this kind of thing before. The judge had no sympathy. Not only did he lose the case, but he was hit with fraud charges. Now, instead of living big, he's serving time. The guy who always thought he could cheat the system finally learned that some risks aren't worth taking. Story 21. My old neighbor, Mr. Thompson, was the classic grump. He was rich, but he never helped anyone and went out of his way to make life miserable for others. He'd report kids for playing outside, call the city about minor things like someone's garbage cans being out too long, and even tried to shut down a local shelter by claiming it brought down property values. One day, he got into a nasty fight with a small business owner, a bakery run by a single mother named Rachel. He took her to court over a supposed zoning violation, trying to force her to shut down. But what he didn't know was that Rachel had a secret weapon. Her brother was a lawyer. During the legal battle, Rachel's brother discovered something interesting. Mr. Thompson had built an extension on his house illegally, violating multiple housing codes. Not only did Rachel win the case, but the city forced Mr. Thompson to either demolish his extension or pay massive fines. With legal fees and fines piling up, he had to sell his house. And guess who bought it? Rachel. She turned it into a bakery and offered free coffee to everyone in the neighborhood, except him. Story 22. My old college friend Nick was obsessed with cryptocurrency. He would always talk about how the financial system was a scam and how he was going to be a millionaire by investing in the right coin. He even convinced a bunch of our friends to put their money in with him, promising huge returns. For a while, it seemed like he was right. His investments skyrocketed, and he started living like a king. Fancy cars, luxury vacations, the whole deal. But then, karma came knocking. He got greedy and started investing in sketchier and sketchier coins, ignoring all the red flags. One day, his entire portfolio crashed overnight due to a massive crypto scam. He lost everything. Worse, the friends who had trusted him with their money also lost their savings. Now, instead of sipping cocktails on a beach, he's working at a gas station, drowning in debt. Some of his old friends even took legal action against him for misleading them. Turns out the real scam was his arrogance. Story 23. A guy at my old job, Daniel, was a classic corporate ladder climber. He didn't care who he stepped on to get ahead. He would throw coworkers under the bus, manipulate his way into promotions, and even spread lies about people to make himself look better. One day, he made the mistake of crossing the wrong person. Our quiet but brilliant coworker, Nina. She had been working on a major project, and Daniel, as usual, tried to steal credit. But Nina had been preparing for this moment for a long time. Before Daniel could present her work as his own, Nina sent an email to the entire department, including the CEO, with timestamps, drafts, and evidence proving the project was hers. The best part? She had also attached proof that Daniel had been manipulating reports and lying about his performance. Daniel was fired within a week. Meanwhile, Nina got promoted to his position. The office never felt better after he was gone. Story 24. My uncle once worked at a car dealership that was known for scamming customers. The owner, Mr. Grady, had been running shady deals for years, rolling back odometers, selling flood-damaged cars, and using fine print in contracts to trap people in terrible deals. He made a fortune off unsuspecting buyers. One day, he sold a used truck to a regular-looking guy named Jeff. What he didn't know was that Jeff was an investigative journalist. Jeff dug into the dealership's records and uncovered a goldmine of fraud. Instead of immediately exposing him, he played along, gathering more evidence while pretending to be just another customer. Then, when he had everything he needed, he published a massive expose. The state launched an investigation, and within months, Mr. Grady was arrested for fraud. His dealership was shut down, and he lost everything. Meanwhile, Jeff won an award for his reporting, and the town finally got rid of a longtime scammer. Story 25. A man named Lewis was an expert scam artist. He ran an online business selling investment courses that promised to teach people how to make passive income. In reality, it was a glorified pyramid scheme. He made his money off signups, and the people who bought in never got anything useful. For years, he lived large, buying expensive cars, posting pictures with celebrities and bragging about his secrets to success. But he made one big mistake. He scammed a retired FBI agent. The agent played along, pretending to be another gullible customer, but was actually building a case. He collected fraudulent contracts, bank records, and complaints from other victims. One day, Lewis woke up to federal agents at his door. He was charged with wire fraud, money laundering, and multiple other crimes. His assets were seized, and he's now serving a lengthy prison sentence. His luxury cars? Sold at auction. His mansion? Gone. The self-made millionaire became just another inmate. Story 26. There was a professor at my university, Dr. Carter, who was notorious for failing students. He wasn't just strict, he was cruel. He would humiliate students for minor mistakes, refuse to give extra help, and even accused people of plagiarism just to ruin their grades. One semester, he targeted a student named Maria, claiming she had copied an essay. Maria was devastated, but instead of giving up, she decided to fight back. She hired a lawyer and requested a full investigation. Turns out, Dr. Carter had been recycling old essays as plagiarism examples, and his software falsely flagged Maria's original work because he had used her own essay as a reference from a previous draft. The university dug deeper and found that he had been unfairly failing students for years. He was forced to resign in disgrace. Maria not only got her grade restored, but went on to graduate with honor. Dr. Carter, meanwhile, never found another teaching job. His reputation was destroyed. Story 27. My cousin Eric was always a smooth talker. He made his living by flipping houses, but did it in the dirtiest way possible, buying cheap homes, covering up serious problems with cosmetic fixes, and selling them at huge markups. He made a killing, and he never took responsibility when buyers discovered the issues later. One day, he sold a house to a retired contractor, Mr. Harris. What Eric didn't know was that Harris had documented everything wrong with the house before he bought it. He waited until the deal was final, then sued Eric for fraud. Harris didn't just win the case. He exposed Eric's entire operation. Previous buyers came forward with lawsuits, and soon, Eric was drowning in legal battles. His business collapsed, and he had to declare bankruptcy. The best part? Harris used the settlement money to fix the house properly and turned it into a rental. Meanwhile, Eric now works as a handyman, barely making ends meet. Story 28. In my small town, there was a woman named Linda who ran a daycare. She seemed sweet, but behind closed doors she was running a scam. She overcharged parents, neglected the kids, and even locked them in separate rooms for hours just so she wouldn't have to deal with them. One day, a parent named Jordan grew suspicious when his toddler started crying whenever they got near the daycare. He installed a tiny recording device in his kid's backpack and captured hours of audio proving Linda was neglecting the children. Jordan took the recordings straight to the authorities. Within days, Linda's daycare was shut down, and she was charged with child endangerment. The kicker? Jordan and a group of parents pooled their money and started a proper daycare, one that actually cared for the kids. Linda, meanwhile, went from running a business to struggling to find work because no one wanted to hire someone with her record. Story 29. A former co-worker of mine, Dave, was the laziest guy in the office. He somehow managed to keep his job by taking credit for others' work and sucking up to management. He had this smug attitude, always saying, "Work smarter, not harder." But one day, karma served him hard. Our company announced a new policy. Annual performance reviews would now be based on peer evaluations, not just manager feedback. When it came time for reviews, everyone destroyed Dave's reputation. We provided evidence of him skipping meetings, taking credit for projects, and faking reports. The company finally saw through his act and fired him. The best part? The person he always belittled, a hardworking intern, was hired in his place. Meanwhile, Dave was last seen complaining on social media about how the corporate world is unfair. Story 30. My old landlord, Mr. Stevenson, was a classic scam artist. He took deposits and never returned them, claimed mysterious fees when people moved out, and even shut off utilities to force tenants to leave if he wanted to raise rent. One day, he messed with the wrong tenant, Elena, a law student. He tried to keep her security deposit, claiming she had damaged the unit. But Elena had taken time-stamped pictures when she moved in, proving the apartment was already in bad shape. She didn't just demand her deposit back, she sued him for unlawful charges. When she won, she used her case as a precedent to help dozens of other tenants file claims against him. Mr. Stevenson ended up losing multiple lawsuits, and the city fined him for housing violations. He had to sell his properties at a loss, and Elena? She became a tenant rights lawyer, making sure landlords like him never got away with their scams again. Story 31. In college, there was a professor who was known for giving unfair grades. He had a tendency to target students he didn't like, and his grading was completely subjective. I watched it happen to a few friends who did excellent work, only to get low grades because the professor simply didn't approve of their approach. One semester, a student named Ben, who was brilliant but socially awkward, decided he wasn't going to take it. He realized that the professor had been grading inconsistently, using different rubrics for different students, which was against university policy. Ben kept track of every assignment, every grade, and even recorded some of the professor's interactions with other students. When finals came around, Ben reported the professor for discrimination. The university launched an investigation and found that the professor had been unfairly grading and even plagiarizing some of his lectures. He was fired on the spot. The best part? Ben didn't just get a passing grade, he got top honors in the department. Story 32. My uncle, a successful businessman, was known for his ruthless ways. He ran a chain of retail stores and had a reputation for firing anyone who questioned him or tried to offer a better idea. He would steal ideas from employees and take credit, and when people were at their lowest, he'd help them, but for a steep price. One day, a young employee named Kelly, who had worked there for several years, developed a brilliant marketing idea that could have taken the company to the next level. Kelly shared it with my uncle, only to have him take full credit and present it as his own to upper management. Kelly, instead of being crushed, decided to quietly start her own company, using the very idea that my uncle stole. She marketed it aggressively, and within 2 years, her startup was worth more than my uncle's entire chain of stores. Meanwhile, my uncle's business began to flounder due to poor decisions, and he was eventually forced to sell out to a competitor. Kelly's company was the one that bought it. Story 33. When I first started working at a tech company, there was a manager named Trevor who had a knack for taking credit for everything. He would claim responsibility for projects that weren't even his, lie about deadlines, and set his team up for failure while making himself look like a genius. Trevor was also incredibly insecure and would sabotage the progress of anyone who posed a threat to his image. One day, I found myself working on a major client proposal. It was a massive opportunity, and Trevor kept saying he'd take care of presenting it. But I suspected he had no intention of doing the actual work. I quietly made my own adjustments to the presentation, adding the details Trevor had missed. When it came time for the big meeting, Trevor's part of the presentation was a disaster, full of errors and misunderstandings. But my additions were spot on. The client loved the proposal, and when it came time to finalize everything, they asked for me to be their point of contact instead of Trevor. It was a hard blow for him, but what really stung was that my work had been the key to landing the deal. Trevor ended up being reassigned to a different department. Story 34. I once worked for a man named Richard, who ran a small publishing company. He was a narcissist, someone who always took credit for the hard work of others and rarely paid his employees fairly. He'd use contracts that heavily favored him, knowing his employees had little choice but to sign. One of his authors, Sarah, was fed up with the way he took a large chunk of her royalties without any justification. But instead of confronting him directly, she decided to research his financial records. Over several months, she uncovered evidence that Richard had been hiding large sums of money from the tax authorities and underreporting income from his publishing deals. Armed with this knowledge, Sarah went to the authorities, and the IRS launched an investigation into Richard's finances. In the end, he faced years of tax evasion charges, lost his company, and was forced to pay back millions in back taxes. Sarah, on the other hand, used the payout from her royalties to start her own publishing company. She now helps authors protect their rights, making sure no one falls victim to a scam like Richard's. Story 35. A guy I went to high school with, Blake, was always the cool kid, the one who had a fancy car, the best clothes, and a huge social media following. He built his persona on looking like he had it all figured out. What most people didn't know was that Blake's wealth came from a shady contract with his parents, where they funded his lifestyle while he pretended to have his own successful startup. When the truth started to unravel, Blake tried to cover it up. He posted more fake success stories, showed off expensive gifts, and created fake documents to make it seem like he was an entrepreneur. But one day, he made a critical mistake. He posted a contract on his social media by accident. It wasn't a business agreement. It was an agreement he had with his parents. The contract explicitly stated that he was to keep up the illusion of success for a monthly allowance. The post went viral. His followers turned on him, his fake business collapsed, and his parents disowned him. Without his social media fame and fake wealth, Blake lost everything: his reputation, his cars, and his extravagant lifestyle. Story 36. When I was a young intern at a large law firm, there was a partner named Gerald who everyone was scared of. He was known for being brilliant in the courtroom, but ruthless and manipulative in business. He'd poach clients, use unethical tactics, and force associates into working insane hours without extra pay. The worst part? He used the contracts to his advantage, making sure that any intellectual property developed by his team was legally his, no matter who came up with the idea. One of his junior lawyers, Anna, had been with the firm for a while. She was ambitious, hardworking, and knew she had what it took to make partner. However, she was constantly overlooked in favor of Gerald's favorites. One day, Anna got hold of a copy of a contract Gerald had been forcing on employees, which had an illegal clause that violated state employment laws. She consulted with an external lawyer and secretly gathered evidence. When the time was right, she filed a class action lawsuit against the firm for unfair labor practices and intellectual property theft. The firm was forced to settle with a large payout to all the employees, and Gerald was removed from his position after the firm's leadership investigated the allegations. Anna went on to start her own successful firm, and Gerald? He was banned from practicing law for a decade. Story 37. A few years ago, I met a guy named Nick, who had a great idea for a tech startup. He'd been pitching it for months, and after some success in early meetings, he convinced a group of investors to give him the capital he needed to build the business. The catch? He made every employee sign a contract stating that all intellectual property they created during their employment belonged exclusively to the company. He claimed it was standard procedure, but there was something about the whole setup that seemed fishy. Things went well initially. The product was gaining traction, and Nick seemed like a genius. But as time went on, he started becoming more demanding. He ignored employee feedback, constantly took credit for others' ideas, and began making rash decisions that hurt the company's growth. Then one of his co-founders, Jason, realized something. Nick had been using the company's funds to pay for personal expenses and was siphoning money off the top. Jason uncovered it after reviewing the company's financial records, and when he confronted Nick, he was threatened with a lawsuit under the same contracts Nick had made everyone sign. Jason didn't back down. Instead, he reached out to the investors with the evidence and filed for a business fraud case. The investors, furious at Nick's deceit, pulled their funding, and the company collapsed. Jason ended up taking over the business, restructuring it, and launching it successfully under a new name. Nick was left with nothing, and his reputation was tarnished. Karma never forgets. Story 38. When I was working at a marketing firm, I had a boss named Lisa, who was charming on the surface but devious underneath. She had a way of taking credit for everyone's work and putting the blame on others when things went wrong. Her tactic was to make her employees feel invaluable and indispensable, but then she'd tie them down with contracts that made it nearly impossible for anyone to leave the company. One of the most frustrating things about Lisa was her habit of manipulating clients into signing long-term, one-sided contracts. She'd convince them that the company's exclusive partnership clause would save them money in the long run, but it really just locked them into high-priced contracts with no exit clauses. Eventually, a client named Charlie caught on to the scam. He realized that his company was losing money because of Lisa's deals, and he refused to sign another extension. But instead of confronting Lisa directly, he quietly started researching other options. He eventually found a competitor offering the same services at half the price, and armed with knowledge, he came back to renegotiate the deal. Lisa tried to intimidate him with her legal contracts, but Charlie had already consulted a lawyer. He ended up suing for breach of contract and unfair business practices, and the company had to pay him a large settlement. As for Lisa, she was fired after an internal audit found several other unethical practices she had been involved in. She had no choice but to leave the industry completely, and the reputation of her firm was permanently damaged. Story 39. I used to work with a woman named Hannah who was ambitious and ruthlessly driven, but in a way that always seemed to harm others. She would promise promotions, make big sales claims, and offer contracts to clients that favored her company, but often had hidden clauses that didn't sit well with people. She was good at convincing others that they could trust her, even though she often manipulated situations to her advantage. One day, she approached me with an opportunity to invest in a side business she was starting. She made it sound like a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, offering a partnership in a project that was supposed to bring in huge returns. However, after reading the contract closely, I realized there was a stipulation that if the business failed, the investor, me, would be on the hook for all debts. And the side business was poorly structured and riddled with risks. I politely declined, but over the next few months I heard horror stories from other people who had signed on. Hannah had made promises that didn't pan out, and soon the business was facing massive financial issues. She tried to use her charm to get out of it, but the debts piled up and investors started suing her. Eventually, Hannah was hit with multiple lawsuits for fraud and breach of contract, and the company had to shut down. She ended up losing everything: her business, her reputation, and her finances. Meanwhile, the investors who had lost money through her manipulations sued for damages, and a judge ruled in their favor, forcing Hannah to sell off her personal assets to repay them. Karma came full circle. Story 40. There was a man named Tom who worked at a small tech startup. He was the kind of guy who seemed trustworthy at first. He was always offering advice and helping the team navigate difficult challenges. But over time, we realized that Tom had been subtly taking advantage of the company's intellectual property. He would pass off his personal projects as company ideas, then sell them to competitors once he knew they'd be valuable. One of his colleagues, Rachel, was the one who finally caught on. She discovered that Tom had stolen code from a project she had been developing for months and presented it as his own to the higher-ups. When she confronted him, Tom played it off as an innocent mistake, claiming he forgot where the code came from. Rachel didn't buy it. Instead, she documented everything, then approached the board of directors with the evidence. The company conducted an internal investigation and found that Tom had been quietly funneling valuable company assets to a rival startup. Tom was immediately fired, and his shares in the company were voided. The worst part, the competitor he had been working with bought out the company's software, but without Tom's contributions, it ended up failing. Tom's reputation was destroyed, and he was banned from working in the industry again. Rachel, however, got promoted and was recognized for her integrity and hard work. Story 41. There was a guy in my office named Richard who was notorious for his shady behavior. He had this knack for finding loopholes in contracts and would exploit them to the fullest. He'd manipulate clauses to his advantage, making his colleagues and clients sign agreements that were nearly impossible to back out of. No one liked him, but they tolerated him because he brought in big deals for the company. One day, he convinced a small business owner named Grace to sign a contract for consulting services that had a clause stating she would have to pay a penalty if she terminated the contract early. The problem? The clause was hidden in the fine print, and Richard had intentionally misled her about its implications. Grace was a small business owner who didn't have much legal knowledge, so she didn't question it. When Grace realized she was being taken advantage of, she was furious. Rather than simply trying to get out of the contract, she decided to take a different route. She hired a lawyer who specialized in business fraud and filed a lawsuit against Richard for breach of trust and unethical business practices. In the end, the court ruled in Grace's favor, and Richard had to pay a hefty settlement to her. Worse, his reputation took a major hit. His clients began pulling out of deals, and he was fired from the company. The irony? Grace ended up using the money from the settlement to start a business consulting firm of her own, one that would never pull the kind of shady moves Richard had. Story 42. I used to work for a company where one of the managers, Trevor, was well known for his terrible treatment of employees. He played favorites, handed out promotions based on who he liked rather than merit, and would fire people on a whim for trivial reasons. But what made him truly unbearable was his ruthless contract policies. He'd make employees sign non-compete clauses that tied them up for years, making it nearly impossible for anyone to leave and work in the same industry. One of Trevor's victims was Mia, a quiet but highly talented employee who was stuck in one of Trevor's restrictive contracts. Mia worked in a technical department and had developed a system that could have revolutionized the company's operations. However, Trevor wasn't interested in rewarding her talent. Instead, he belittled her and took credit for her ideas, just like he had done with others. After working under him for years, Mia finally decided she had had enough. She started quietly looking for a way out and discovered a loophole in her contract that would allow her to leave the company without violating the non-compete clause. But rather than just leave quietly, Mia decided to act. She reported Trevor to HR for harassment, submitted evidence of his unethical behavior, and exposed the company's illegal contract practices. The company launched an investigation and Trevor was fired. Mia was promoted to a managerial role, and the company had to revise its contracts to be more employee-friendly. The best part? Mia left the company shortly afterward to start her own business, which is now one of the leading tech firms in the industry. As for Trevor, he ended up working for a much smaller company, his reputation in tatters. Story 43. A couple of years ago, a friend of mine, Steve, invested in a real estate project that promised huge returns. The project was being led by a man named Greg, who was known for flashy presentations and high-end promises, but had very little actual experience in the industry. Greg had convinced Steve and several other investors to sign a contract that seemed legitimate, but there were a few clauses buried in the fine print. The deal sounded too good to be true. Greg assured everyone that the property was a gold mine, and that it was only a matter of time before it appreciated in value. But as time went on, things started to fall apart. The development was riddled with delays, and Greg's company started to miss deadlines and payments. Steve and the others tried to get their money back, but Greg kept making excuses. Steve decided to investigate further and found out that Greg had been using investor money to pay for personal expenses and had been overinflating the project's value to attract more investors. Steve hired a lawyer and filed a lawsuit against Greg for fraud, breach of contract, and misrepresentation. The court ruled in Steve's favor, and Greg was ordered to pay back the investments and additional damages. However, Greg didn't have enough assets to cover the debt, so his personal finances were seized, and his reputation was destroyed. He ended up losing everything. Meanwhile, Steve recovered his initial investment and used the proceeds to start his own real estate firm, which is now thriving. Karma had finally caught up with Greg.